prior to the railroad coming, the only way to get your crops or your produce or your livestock out to your customers was to literally pack it in the back of a wagon and take it out. So the railroad offered the opportunity for much greater commerce for the community.
I was born here in July the 16th, 1927. I have lived here off and on all my life, but I was born in a house on East Chatham Street, the 200 block, and I lived for many years across the street in another house. When I was a young boy, I lived in Charlotte about 3 years. Then we came back to Cary, and I was here until I graduated from NC State, got a job with the railroad, and they transferred me to Atlanta, Georgia. I lived there about 2 or 3 years, and then went to Savannah, Georgia. And then I came back to Cary, been here ever since.
Now see, when I grew up here, it was a steam engine, had steam engines. And where I lived, my house stood 200 yards back up on a hill, Interstate 40. And so when they were deciding where they were going to put Interstate 40, it was the lowest place between Raleigh and Cary to go on the railroad track. So we had to move. We had no choice.
My father worked for the Southern Railroad, and I was be able to go down and keep up with the trains and so forth. So I would count on the train sheet each day how many trains passed through Cary. During the latter stages of World War II, there would be 80 to 90 every day. Some days close to 100 in a 24-hour period. Can you believe that? I know that for a fact because I counted them on the train sheet myself several times.
The train station was right there where those trucks are parked, in between the tracks. One was Seaboard and one was Southern, and the train station stood there. And I can remember coming up here and buying coal to put in our stove at the house way back down over there where we lived. The story I get, Seaboard came in here one day and they tore the train station down, didn't say we're gone, anything, they just tore it down in one day and they were gone. But fortunately, some of the artists here in town got a picture of that train station. And it's just an old train station. It's got Cary NC on there. And and I have a picture of it in my den at home of the Cary train station, and it's one of my treasures that I have.
Page Walker is important because it was built by our town's founder, Frank Page. And Frank lived right next door where the town hall is. His house burned in 1970. But he built this hotel in 1868.
Frank Page was an entrepreneur. He knew a good business model when he saw one. He moved here initially for lumber, but he was also very much aware that one railroad line had come through and another one was about to come through Cary. So he built what was the Page Hotel at that time to be able to serve passengers on the railroad.
He built the hotel to service railway passengers. And that day, if you were a salesman, you were called a drummer. And what the train would do would be to pull up to different places. You could get off, have your food. You could stay overnight if you wanted to. But it serviced railroad passengers.
Page Walker was an important building when it was built. Back in 1868, right at the end of after the Civil War, Frank Page built this building in a town that was probably no more than about 150 or 200 people. It was a fancy French Second Empire building in a town that small with mostly just dirt roads. But it was built here as a railroad hotel. And the railroads and Frank Page are critical to sort of the early development years of Cary.
So I guess the importance of the hotel was it put Cary on the map. Cary was incorporated in 1871, right after the hotel was built, and serviced railroad passengers for up until 1914.
The Pages were instrumental in making Cary Cary. Well, it's almost what the Pages didn't do in their time in Cary. Frank Page was the first postmaster. He was an early mayor. He helped found and incorporate the town of Cary. He's even the gentleman who gave Cary its name, Cary. Frank was a big believer in temperance, didn't believe in alcohol being consumed, and he had heard of a gentleman named Samuel Fenton Cary, a temperance man that Frank Page very much admired. And so he chose to name the community after someone who he thought had great high moral fiber. Walter Hines Page was the eldest son of Frank and Kate Page. He was perhaps Cary's most famous native son. He was an author, an educator, a publisher, and most famously, he was appointed by President Wilson to become the ambassador to Great Britain just prior to World War I. His influence, many say, actually encouraged our government to take up sides with Britain and fight in World War I.
Page let my great aunt's husband have an acreage through here after Page had built this building here. And so Walker ran the hotel here for many years.
Jacob was still running his own farming business, and Helen was largely responsible for the running of the hotel. She was known for her excellent cooking, and during the time that she was here, there were many locals who came here to have their noontime meals. After her death, it became a boarding house, and teachers from the Cary High School actually lived here at the Page Walker.
When my parents moved out into the farm area, both of them had been raised on country farms, from what I remember them talking about when I was growing up. But they sent us to the Raleigh schools. Both of them worked in town, and so we'd ride back and forth with one until I became a 10th grader at Cary. We made friends, and we decided we did not want to go back to Broughton High School because it was too big. We got lost in the crowd. So we transferred and came to Cary High School as a 10th grader, and my sister came as a 9th grader. Best thing that probably ever happened in our life.
Built in 1870, it was originally a private school for children of local landowners.
It was certified in 1896, and in 1896 it was the first certified public school in North Carolina.
They emphasized not only academics, but they emphasized a great deal of practical education, as they called it. Farming, young men learned how to run a farm efficiently and effectively. Young women learned domestic skills. So it was really a vocational educational school as well as an academic school.
It was at that time probably the largest 1A school in Wake County. We had 340-some students at Cary High School at that time.
It continued to grow and prosper to the point where it was really almost the size of a small junior college.
I stop and think about when I was in high school, and a lot of times after school we'd come down to Adams's drugstore.
He had 2 drugstores and 1 grocery store, and that was it. It's a lot different from when I lived here in the early 60s and late 50s when you had to go to Raleigh to buy a pair of shoes.
Cary remained a small town really until the 1950s and early 1960s, when it began to grow at the same time that the Research Triangle Park was getting off the ground.
They had brought in a lot of people from out of state, and they were looking for places close by, and several of them landed here in Cary.
Starting in the 1960s, they doubled in population each decade until the year 2000, and by then they had become the 7th largest municipality in the state. They did a great job in managing the growth, starting in the early 70s with my uncle, who was the mayor at the time, Fred Bond. They did the first planned unit development, which was Kildare Farms. When I grew up, there was actually a Kildare Farms. And so my first grade class would go on a field trip to see the chickens and things like that. When they built that, they made sure everything was planned appropriately, and they paid a lot of attention to aesthetics. And so planning along with aesthetics and getting the right companies to move here made a big difference in how this town evolved and how it grew.
Other than the growth, there hasn't been a lot of what I would classify as change. Change to me means you start doing things differently, or you change the picture of something. We are very, very fortunate in having had outstanding leaders in our mayors, in our councils, in our town managers that we've had. So they have sort of set guidelines, precedents for how Cary should move forward, and that's been followed. So it hasn't necessarily changed, it's just continued to get better and better and better.
The United States, for the most part, is not that old of a country. And so Cary has history about it pretty close to the age of the United States and North Carolina. It was a railroad town. The Page Walker was important for that. Had the first public high school in North Carolina, which was very important. And those are things that we need to remember.